I think it might be important to state at this stage that the notion of a Vienna Circle as such might be a slight misnomer, because in fact, as I mentioned earlier, that the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire had resulted in these far-flung parts of empire, namely Warsaw, Prague. Well, Warsaw hadn't been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it had been part of the Russian partition of Poland. Perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit about that, of why you had to gallivant, as it were, around Central Europe.
Good. Yes, well, one could think of Vienna Circle in perhaps three senses of increasing breadth. One, those sitting around the table in Vienna. Second, reaching farther out, but thinking of the same sort of philosophy, scientific philosophy. Mm-hmm. And that has to include Hans Reichenbach and Karl Hempel, both of whom were in Berlin. Mm-hmm. And then a broader circle then, which perhaps doesn't deserve that name at all, but in view of the intimate connections between modern logic and logical empiricism, there's mathematical logic, and that has had its centers, greater centers really, in Göttingen and Warsaw, then in Vienna by all means. Mm-hmm. And its earlier history had been, well, in Poland there was a history stemming from Lemberg, from Lvov, and then flourishing in a big way in Warsaw. Mm-hmm. And then independently again, partly because of Frege, but through Hilbert in Göttingen, and then as a third very important locality was at the time was Cambridge in England, but and that was Whitehead and Russell with their Principia Mathematica, but that didn't bear fruit in England particularly.
Who most impressed you of the logicians that you met in Warsaw?
Tarski. Tarski most, but the three that I talked with at such length, they were tremendously hospitable, were Łukasiewicz, Leśniewski, and Tarski. I argued a good deal with Leśniewski. I agreed with some of the things, tried to argue him out of others, had points having to do with ontology. But I certainly admired his rigor, and likewise Łukasiewicz. But Tarski was the most inspiring, and also I felt the deepest in logic.
How long were you in Europe in all, so to speak, doing philosophy?
Lapse time, it would have been from October to June. So there's 9 months. There were intervals in those 9 months when I was when I was broken away for maybe a month. Well, yes, it was about a month in Italy and North Africa, and then there was a month before all that, but that was September in the Balkans. And I was in Europe about 11 months, but actually doing philosophy more like 7, I suppose.
Would you say you were fluent in German, in the German language by that time?
I would say fairly fluent, yes, at the end. At the beginning, I certainly was not. I'd had 1 year of German in college, and it hadn't been enough even to get me through Harvard's PhD preliminary in the philosophy department in German. The first time I had to take the second crack at it. French went easily in the first time. But once I got to Vienna, I buckled down to it. I attended Schlick's lectures in Erkenntnis, in the theory of knowledge, for the language really, rather than the content in those days. And and I read. I read writings of Reichenbach, philosophy of quantum mechanics, and this and that, and I was using German, of course, around town all the time, and I gave a paper in German at the Vienna Circle, telling them what I had done in my PhD dissertation, and when I got to Vienna, to Prague with Carnap, German was without exception the language then. Carnap wasn't using English at all as a spoken language. Of course, you read it easily. And German continued to be my language when I was in Warsaw. Except for, I remember there was one man with whom I had to resort to French. And then there was, as I said, Sobocinski, who had to be interpreted to me between between Polish and German by Leśniewski.
Professor Quine, without a doubt you were talented and gifted, but there's no doubt about it that you were, at least with the Poles, you were sharing a second language. You were immersed in a totally different culture. You were 23 years old at the time. 24 years old at the time. Is it not possible that in all of this that you could have, as it were, come back with considerably less than the full picture? That there might have been aspects of what you were exposed to that you didn't actually completely understand at the time?
There must have been, ones that I simply wasn't aware of. I'm not aware of any that were puzzling me.
Right.
But certainly I must have missed a good deal. Internal friction in the circle, perhaps. Internal friction in Warsaw, perhaps. No room for friction in Prague. There were just Philipp Frank and Carnap, imports from Vienna, both of them, in this otherwise Czechish surroundings.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier Freddie Ayer, the late Alfred J. Ayer, whom you encountered in Vienna, who was also invited to join the circle, the other Anglophone, as it were. Now, he returned to England profoundly influenced by his exposure to the Vienna Circle, and shortly afterwards published the famous language, or infamous Language, Truth and Logic. And Ayer said later that the major defect of logical positivism was that really all of it was false. Now, he cites you as one of the major philosophers who helped to take apart some of the major doctrines of logical positivism. Could you explain, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight or what you thought of the time, how your approach to logical positivism, as it were, differed from Ayer's approach?
I hadn't thought of myself as destroying that tradition of logical, attacking it, as contributing to what seemed to me it needed further development. Thinking of it as one thinks of science in general, and what I had felt so valuable about logical empiricism, about the Vienna view, early and late, and especially through Carnap, was the logical rigor that it aspired to and at some points achieved. And what I was taking issue with was pretty much, I think, in the domain of logical rigor and also of being more completely empiricistic. In short, the way I felt was that I was insisting on the ideals of what I thought to be the ideals of the Vienna Circle, more than they, and saying what I thought they ought to be saying. So I didn't think of, I didn't have a sense of destroying a movement.